Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We will begin now with Sefer Vayikra, and we'll begin with the Ramban's introduction to Sefer Vayikra. Ramban says, Sefer Hazeh Toras Kohanim Leviim. This book really encompasses the laws for Kohanes and Levis. Yevorbo Inyani HaKarbanos Kulan Mishmaras HaMishkan. Topics regarding the sacrifices are discussed in this book, and appropriate guardianship of the Mishkan is discussed. We know that Sefer Shmos had the book of Exodus, had to do with the exile and the redemption. And the closure of the book of the redemption had to do with the tent of meeting and the honor of God, which filled the Mishkan. If you remember, we discussed at the beginning of Sefer Shmos that the topic of the Mishkan is really the logical closure to the redemption, because it's not just about being freed, it's about the new relationship that was cultivated with God. So now, if the last book ended off with the remarkable presence of God within the Mishkan, it only follows that this book should be all about the offerings and the proper laws within the Mishkan. Ramban says because it's more than just a how-to manual, it's even more than that, because it's such a special thing to have the divine presence in the Mishkan. And if the Jewish people sin, that will be reason for the divine presence to depart the Mishkan. And the way to repair the negative effect of sin is to bring offerings that are atonements for the sins. So this is fundamentally connected not only to the fact that the last book ended off with the Mishkan, but it's that the last book ended off with the remarkable presence of God within the Mishkan and how special that was for the Jewish people, and that therefore it's incumbent upon them to be very diligent about these matters. V'tzivahu b'kohanim hanigashim el Hashem sheyiskadashu. And there are instructions regarding the special sanctifying of the Kohanim for their unique role. Shehizir al tumas mikdash v'kadasha, that he warns about laws involving ritual impurity. V'gam shlo yersu lalos el Hashem, and that they can't come up too close to God. This idea that there's a certain area that they can only go into Yom Kippur time. Okay. And that the idea in general that the Mishkan as a whole has to be sort of respected with a distance, the same way that that's what happened at Har Sinai. If you remember, there was this very special mountaintop, and the Jewish people were not to come up to the mountaintop. Most of this book has to do with sacrifices. B'Toras HaKorban, laws regarding the sacrifice itself, v'hamakrivim, and laws regarding the people who bring the sacrifices, and the place to which the sacrifice should be brought. And there are some mitzvos that will kind of be pulled along with this topic. We start off by instructing regarding voluntary offerings. And he clarifies that the certain parts of the fat and the blood may not be consumed with them. Then he goes on to sacrifices regarding sin, that sacrifices that are atonements for sin. Then we get into non-kosher food. You might wonder to yourself, what does non-kosher food have to do with any of this? Well, non-kosher food renders someone ritually impure. For us, we're really not particular about that today, because we're not particular about ritual purity. We just don't eat non-kosher food because we're prohibited from the Torah to eat non-kosher food. But besides that, there was also ritual impurity. If a person were to touch that food or to eat it, they're not allowed to come into the Mishkan. They have to purify themselves before coming into the Mishkan. So this is very relevant to the Mishkan. And by the way, if a person were to enter having been ritually impure, there's a special sacrifice they have to bring. Then we need to get into the laws of tsaras. Tsaras is the person loosely translated as leprosy. We'll wait then for you to hear me say 17 times during the week that it's not leprosy. But in any event, at the end of that period of tsaras, there's korbanos that are brought. So that's relevant to this book. And the laws of a woman who gives birth, there are korbanos that are brought. Then a person, a man, a woman who has different fluids come from them, there are korbanos that are brought. To both explain the korbanos, the sacrifice that they bring, and to warn them, to caution them regarding the ritual impurity associated with their state. You should separate the Jewish people from their impurity. And they should not die in their ritual impurity in their defiling my Mishkan. Then after that, we talk about that the Jewish people are cautioned to not have illicit sexual relations. Because there are various sexual relations that if a person has them, they would be rendered ritually impure. Va'avonam yikare tuma. And the sin itself is known as ritual impurity. Go remes l'sila kashchina l'galos. That if people are not diligent about this, if the nation is not diligent about this, this will cause the Jewish people to not have the divine presence in their midst and to be exiled. And there's another way that the topic of illicit sexual relations fits into sacrifices, because if a person didn't know that something was prohibited and they did it in terms of these sexual relations, they would have to bring us an offering. Then it talks about Shabbos and Yom Tovim. You might think to yourself, what does Shabbos and Yom Tovim have to do with the Mishkan? A lot. Bavura Korban. They are special offerings brought on those days. V'rov Parshos HaSefer Hazeh Yidaber Bohen Ima Kohanim. The primary intended audience of this book is the Kohanim. Daber el Aaron v'Elpanav. Many times God tells Moshe, speak to Aaron and his sons. Tzavas Aaron v'Elpanav, command Aaron and his sons. Parshas Kedoshim, K'tzas Mitzvos L'Bnei Yisrael. Parshas Kedoshim is going to be a sort of a not random, but a cross section of mitzvahs from Jewish people. Ruben Nigroros and Minyane Hakabaros Obadom Lahem. And like everything else in this book, most of the mitzvahs in Parshas Kedoshim have some connection in some way to sacrifices. And I'll explain as we go along the specifics. What's really interesting about this Ramban is, to be candid, we know that the book of Vayikra has to do a lot with sacrifices, but it's just an interesting Ramban to keep in the back of our minds as we proceed through the book, because there are a lot of things in this book that don't directly have to do with sacrifices. And what the Ramban did is he sort of set a few broad principles that through these principles, practically everything is considered to tie back to sacrifices in the Mishkan. So just interesting to think about. Okay. Verse 1, chapter 1, verse 1. Vayikra Moshe, Vaydaber Hashem Elav Me'ol Moed Lemor. God spoke to Moshe, and God called to Moshe, and God spoke to him from the tent of meeting. And there's a very famous thing, if you're looking on in your Chumash, I'm sure you see that on the word Vayikra, it has a small aleph over here. And there's a famous discussion about the small aleph at the beginning of Sefer Vayikra. Many things are said. We're going to go to the Kli Yakar on Pasuk Aleph to begin this discussion. Vayikra Moshe. Aleph shel Vayikra Ketana. The aleph in Vayikra is small. Kilu nemar Vayikar. As if it was saying that he kind of happened upon Moshe. V'tamo shel davar lahashvos nevuas Moshe el nevuas Bilam shenemar bo lashon Vayikar. A famous thing that we know that there was this great prophet of the non-Jews known as Bilam, and when God speaks to Bilam, it says sometimes Vayikar kind of happened upon him. When God speaks to Moshe, it's a much more honorable language. He calls out to Moshe. But the idea is that in this one place, Moshe made a small aleph because he wanted to, the famous medrash is he wanted to equate himself to Bilam in some sense. Kamosha Amru, v'lo kamna v'od b'Yisrael kamosha, aval ba'umos kam, umano Bilam. And this actually, normally when this medrash is said over as, wow, wasn't that Moshe a humble person? Of course, he was a very humble person. Torah tells us he was a humble person. But the way the Sifri is saying it over is actually, there's truth to the statement that there is a fair comparison between Moshe and Bilam. We say, Lo kamna v'od b'Yisrael k'Moshe. There was no other prophet in Israel like Moshe. So there's a way to understand that verse as saying there was no other prophet in Israel like Moshe, but there was a prophet outside of Israel like Moshe, and that was Bilam. Okay, now this is very bizarre for us. Moshe Rabbeinu is this great Navi. Bilam is this bizarre figure that sort of floats into the story in the Chumash. We're saying they're the same, they're equal. Vayikra says, "Veina perushiyah Bilam shavel Moshe benvuah chalila." It's not to say that Bilam and Moshe were equal, heaven forbid. Elakach perusho. Here's what it means: Shemoshe hisig yoser mima shayoroi lahasig al pi hachanasa. That Moshe actually got more than he would have gotten in prophecy based on his own preparation. Moshe Nemar, Asher Yidao Hashem, Asher Yodas Hashem Lo Nemar, Elomer Lach, Shu Mitzad Hachanasa Lo Yodas Hashem Azel Ofen, Ki Hashem Yidao V'Nasa Lo Tosefes Shefa. It's already getting late, so I'll just summarize what he's saying. His pshat is as follows: that Moshe Rabbeinu was a great Navi. And broadly speaking, there could be two factors that impact what level prophecy, what level clarity of communication with God a Navi has. Of course, what's very important is the person's own spiritual level and the person's sort of preparing themselves, focusing themselves to be able to get such remarkable revelations from God. But we say there's another factor as well, and that is that sort of the circumstances of the time warranting it. And the idea being that Klal Yisrael needed a great Navi to be able to accurately convey the Torah. Could you imagine if the Torah was conveyed to a person who sort of kind of got what God was talking about? He had 90% clarity on God's communications. We couldn't rely on anything. So at this point in Jewish history, we needed a remarkable Navi. And Moshe was the right person for that role, of course. But what we're saying that there's a similarity between Moshe and Bilam is they actually have something in common. They both got greater prophecy than they would have gotten in their own right. Moshe, because he was the emissary of the Jewish people, and the Jewish people needed a great Navi. That's actually the meaning of the pasuk. When the Jewish people had a great Navi, no one compared to Moshe Rabbeinu. In other words, he deserved to be that person who would be the great Navi of the Jewish people. But he didn't deserve in his own right to have such lofty prophecy. The loftiness of his prophecy was in the merit of Klal Yisrael. But if somebody was going to have such lofty prophecy, he was the right one for that task. Bilam did not remotely deserve what he had as prophecy. God wanted to run an experiment. God wanted to show what happens when we have a great prophet outside of the Jewish people and how that all works. And that's why Bilam had the abilities that he had. So they're similar in the sense that they both got greater nevuah than they would have deserved in their own right. It's an interesting, I have to look closer to Vayikra to see if it's worth it to go further inside tomorrow or not, or move on from there. Stay tuned. But it's an interesting idea to think about. And I think the takeaway should not be, oh, Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't that great. I don't think that's the takeaway. I think the takeaway is how seeing our essential nature as the Jewish nation. And our role in this world is so important that God gave Moshe a remarkable nevuah in the merit of the Jewish people. I think that's the way to look at it.